Plato was a Greek philosopher who kicked around ancient Greece about 400 years BC, and he's widely regarded to be the most important philosopher in the history of ever. In fact, someone much less accomplished than Plato once said that all of Western philosophy is nothing but a bunch of footnotes on Plato. He came up with everything before anybody ever had a chance to try. The man was prolific, unbelievably so, because back in those days it was actually possible to be a philosopher by occupation, and really what else was there to do in ancient Greece? Plato had an interesting way of writing down his ideas. Rather than laying it all out in some giant textbook, all of Plato's work was composed in the form of crossover fan fiction, starring his best friend Socrates as well as a bunch of other philosophers who were around at the time. This was called Socratic dialogue, and it usually took the form of a story about some party or event in which a bunch of philosophers got together, got wasted, and argued about something. Of course, the problem for researchers today is that Plato made it very difficult for us to figure out what the other philosophers actually thought as opposed to what he thought, since his life work was dedicated to the art of putting words in other people's mouths, and back in ancient Greece there were no libel laws to stop him from doing that. A central part of Plato's philosophy is what's known as the theory of forms, which he illustrates through the cave analogy. For Plato, the world in which we live is similar to living inside a cave and only seeing the shadows of real objects on the wall, while the actual complete objects outside the cave were invisible. For Plato, every concept, whether material or abstract, had a true perfect form floating around out there, and while we couldn't see it, we did remember seeing it. Plato thought that everybody was born with all the knowledge in the universe, and learning is actually remembering. So everything we think we know about, for example love, is actually a half-remembered shadow of the true concept of love, which we knew before we were born and just forgot all about. And it's the same for everything you know about every concept, from beauty to Bruce Willis to democracy. Incidentally, Plato hated democracy about as much as it's possible for anyone to hate anything, and that's understandable because the ancient Greeks democratically voted to have Plato's teacher and BFF Socrates poisoned to death. For Plato, democracy is a bit of a bleeding heart feel-good system that utterly fails in practice because people have a tendency to only vote for the biggest jerks. Just look at the people who are running whatever country you're in right now and try to tell Plato he's wrong. Plato liked to think that a state was like a really big person anyway, where we can think of a state as having the features of an individual just on a larger scale. He thought that we can divide the human soul into three virtues: wisdom, courage, and moderation. The state, then, could also be divided into three parts: the rulers, the police, and the workers. Unsurprisingly, the rulers in Plato's perfect society were the philosophers. Plato thought that a society should be run by a commune of philosopher kings, and his plan was for all the smartest and wisest people in Greece to shack up together and have lots of swingers parties so that when the kids were born nobody would know who the real fathers were. Nevertheless, it would be certain they were bred for their intelligence and genetic purity. This concept is pretty controversial today because it sounds a lot like an idea that some guy named Hitler had. Even though most Western nations have come to adopt democracy anyway, and nobody takes the theory of form seriously anymore, Plato stands apart as the guy who basically invented philosophy, and when it can be said that 2,500 years of thought are just footnotes on your own work, you might then be in a position to judge him.